Many things get lost in translation when you're dealing with communication between cultures. And what is multiculturalism other than any number of cultures being jammed together, cheek by jowl? And there are a number of ways that this can be illustrated. I'm going to start with an example that has to do with terminology, but I want to expand it so that you can see how this really can cause all kinds of problems and open the gates to subversion. Okay, so we start with an example. There was something going on in California with some Republican who's a Muslim, as I understand it, who'd been running for office and apparently was catching all kinds of flack because he's a Muslim. And this, led to all kinds of back and forth. And, the rhino types in California are like, oh, it doesn't matter. It's no big deal. We accept everyone. All religions are welcome. And what they missed was this guy's name is Shahid. And if you don't know any Arabic, then obviously you're not going to know what the words mean. And names are important. So one guy, I think, maybe the one, I might be misremembering, but I think the guy who drove his car up onto the curb in that jogging area in New York and killed and maimed all those people, if I'm not mistaken, his first name was Saifullah. And you'll see them spelling it all kinds of ways in order to make it harder to get at the roots of what that name is really about. When I say them spelling it in different ways, I'm referring to journalists of one kind and another, often usually activists. Anyway, Saifullah means sword of Allah. So you get the name like sword of Allah and you kind of think to yourself, I wonder if the people in that family had a really strong Muslim perspective, and maybe they feel that the Dar al-Islam, which in Arabic means the abode of peace, which means the territory controlled by Islam, perhaps they think, as all good Muslims do, since it's taught in the Quran and the Sunnah and the Hadith, perhaps they think that the Dar al-Islam should be expanded, taken out into the abode of war, called the Dar al-Harb. Well, if they felt that way, it would make perfect sense for them to name their son Sword of Allah. And then this guy named Sword of Allah drives his car up on the curb and kills a bunch of people. So anyway, coming back to this guy who's out there in California, his first name is Shahid. Not that most people are going to do it, but if you go and try to take a look, you'll see that Shahid translates as martyr. So far, so good. No big deal, right? Christians have martyrs, right? No big deal. Why would we take exception to some person of another religion being named martyr? Well, here's the rub, so to speak, what I'm trying to get at with the issues with multiculturalism and things that can be lost in translation. Well, we put down martyr. We hear Shahid, we look in the little dictionary or we look it up online and it says martyr. And well, Christians have martyrs too. That's just straightforward stuff. But if you don't really know what's going on in that culture, and it's understandable when your country is just a mishmash of cultures all competing, well, then you don't know about the difference between a Muslim martyr and a Christian martyr. See, a Christian martyr is like somebody who got thrown into the arena with a bunch of lions and got eaten. So for a Christian, you've got a martyr like, Saint Sebastian, I think, who's full of arrows. Catherine, Saint Catherine with the wheel she was broken on. Christian martyrs are people who died for their faith, but they do it in a non-violent way. So when you say Muslim martyr, is it the same? No, because a Shahid is specifically someone who died in battle promoting Islam. So it seems like martyr and martyr, right? Just two words. They mean the same thing, don't they? No, they don't at all. A Christian martyr is someone who peacefully, without resisting, holds to their faith to the point that they're willing to die rather than renounce it. A Muslim Shahid is someone who was killed in the process of killing other people because they're not Muslims and won't convert. So in the case of a Christian martyr, it's someone who's willing to die for their faith to passively bear witness to the glory of God, or whatever fashion they might explain it. In the case of a Muslim, It's something rather different. So coming all the way back around to this first point of divergence, it kind of raises some questions when the guy being elected to office is called martyr for the faith, but a martyr who lost his life in the act of war, bringing war to the Dar al-Harb, the abode of war, in order to extend the abode of peace. So we can see a lost in translation there. And that's just an example taken specifically from a word. Well, are there other ways that this kind of disconnect can occur, where we think we're talking about one thing, the other people are perfectly happy to allow us to keep thinking that we're talking about that one thing, when in fact we're not? And I'll give you an example from Islam, and I'll give you an example from communism. Now, with the example from Islam, I should also point out, everybody talks about taqiyya. Taqiyya is just one of the permissible forms of dissimulation that Muslims are allowed to operate under. Taqiyya is the idea that when your life is threatened, you are permitted to say just about whatever you want. You can lie in order to protect yourself, your faith, and fellow believers. Now, that's just one kind of dissimulation permissible under Islam. Another one is called tawriya, and yet another one is called kitman. Now, I can't remember which is which, so forgive me. You can look it up and you'll find it. Just do a search for taqiyya and also include the word kitman, K-I-T-H-M-A-N. But one of those, I think it's tawriya, but I'm not positive, is where you're permitted to say something that can be taken in multiple ways, and you mean it one way. You know that the person will take it another way, but you're allowed to say it that way because it's their fault if they chose the wrong one of the options for what this thing could mean. So that's another thing to bear in mind when we're talking about these cultural disconnects, these issues with translation. So I said I'd give you a communist example and a Muslim one. Well, in the case of Islam, as many of you know, there is no distinction between church and state. None. Not one of any kind. Now, there are different interpretations of Sharia depending on your school of jurisprudence. If you're Salafist, Wahhabite, and there are other ones, I want to say Hanafi and Hanbali, but I've probably got the words all confused in my mind. But the reason you have these different schools of Islam is because these schools are schools of jurisprudence. So the way Islam breaks out is how the codes of laws developed. And they have certain fundamental features that are all the same, like the focus on absolute unity, which they call tawhid, tawhid. This is the idea that everything must be united, and anything that divides that unity that should be present under God, the peace, but the peace that comes from submission. Salam does not mean peace. It means submission and obedience. It secondarily means peace, in the sense that if you're a good Muslim, then you will have a peaceful life because you will not anger God, because you will not violate God's commands. So you've got schools of jurisprudence that form the divisions, the major divisions within Islam, other than the central ones between Shia and Sunni. And that has to do with whether or not you think that the government of the community should come from the caliph, who is chosen in some fashion, or if it should go through Muhammad's bloodline, through his daughter Fatima, who married Ali. And that bloodline, Hassan and Hussein, that leads to Shiism. But the schools of jurisprudence are how they divide it, which tells you right at the outset that the religion is the state. It is a theocracy. The state is the religion. Okay, so we're coming back to our idea about lost in translation. In the case of Islam, you have no division between church and state. Now, when we talk about this lost in translation thing, here's the Muslim example. What happens when a religion comes in, masquerades as only being a religion, whether that's active or passive, whether it's taqiyya or tawriya, where it could mean a couple things and you're perfectly happy to let the gyavr, the kafir, believe whatever it is that's most convenient. It doesn't really matter. The point is that they come in and they ask for religious protections in the West. And because we, in our culture, are aware of, have instituted a division between the church and state. When we hear about Islam and the government, we think about two things. It's like you hold up this, you've got two fingers up, right? Because they're clearly two things according to us. But for Muslims, they're holding up one finger because there's only one thing there that they see. There's absolute unity. The one sin that cannot be forgiven in Islam is called shirk. And this sin is, they call it polytheism, but it doesn't mean that you have many gods. It means that you place anything beside, next to, or anywhere near God. And that includes any state form of government. So this is the point I'm trying to get across. You know, they say shaheed, we think, oh, it means martyr. And we both go, yes, it means martyr. Except those are two very different martyrs. In the case of this example with church and state, we conceive of them as different. So the Muslims arrive, they say, we must have protection against the government for our religion. We deserve protection because we've got freedom of worship here. We've got freedom of religion. And yet, because they see no distinction there, that just becomes a mechanism for them to burrow deeper, arguably, and to subvert state institutions because they wish to replace them. We say, well, we'll let you have freedom of religion, but this part over here, that's the state, is distinct. Well, they don't recognize that distinction. Now, they're perfectly happy to let you think that they recognize that distinction, but that makes no matter. Now, I'll give you a second example of this lost in translation kind of thing. And this came to my mind because I was looking at an article. It was, I think it was in The Guardian, but it was something with the headline or under the banner of The Observer. I don't know if it's an opinion piece or something that just gets done on the weekend, but anyway, you can find it if you want to. It's something about surveillance capitalism. And I was looking at this thing and it's all about, you know, capitalism. I'm like, wow, we do have a surveillance thing going on with all our digital devices. I mean, the phone you carry with you has, you know, cameras on both sides, ever more sensitive microphones that can, you know, hear you belch from across the room. Yeah, there's a problem with surveillance. You know, anybody with any sense puts a little tab over their computer, you know, and that still doesn't help you with the microphone. You're surrounded by listening devices. That's why I love it in television programs when they're like, is he wearing a wire? I'm like, I don't know. Does he have a phone in his pocket? How about you? You know? So yeah, there's an issue with surveillance, but it was interesting to me to see this thing in The Guardian about surveillance capitalism. Why would it be capitalism? Well, that's an interesting thing. As you go forward with commies, socialists, utopians, whatever you want to call them, they too are in a situation where they see one thing where we see two. We see the government and commerce and business as these two separate things. But is that really the case for commies? Take a look at China. You know, they move undercover, like with Huawei or whatever the fuck you want to call it, you know, under cover of protections that business, that trade, that merchants, that commerce gets when they come to the West. Oh, it's just a company. Well, yeah, they're perfectly happy to allow us to continue to imagine that it's just a company. But the fact is, there is no distinction for them between companies and government. It's all one big animal. And that works out really nicely for them, because when the beast that is half government, half business, and you can't even say that because the two aspects interpenetrate so thoroughly, when that beast lets slip some aspect of the panopticon. What's that from my poem? I recommend you all check out my poem called The Church of State. It's a damn good poem. Damn good poem. And I wouldn't say that about all my poems, but I labored over that motherfucker. Every syllable is in place. Anyway, in that I mentioned the panopticon has grown fat with the facts of its own networked apotheosis, and still Leviathan lists, fly blown with ism and ist, taking us down as it goes. With the socialist business state creature, and these aspects can never be separated, they really see it as one thing. And you see how useful it is for them? There gets to be a problem with where corporations and the government work together, like with Google, for example, and state powers within the government, as we saw recently with the 2016 elections. Well, if it's apparently a problem with the government and you want to defuse that, then you just point over here and say, oh no, it's business, it's surveillance, capitalism, right? But if it's a problem with business, the business can turn around and say, no, it's a problem over here, it's with the state. Because we're still imagining there are two fingers, two objects. It's like, do you see two fingers or one? We see two. They see just one. So this is something that we need to be aware of. When you're dealing with a religion that's explicitly a religion, like Islam, that doesn't recognize any distinction between a religion and state, or when you're dealing with a religion that pretends to be secular, that pretends not to be a religion, that also sees no distinction between two things, in this case, the business and the state, as China is such a glorious example, of which China is such a glorious example, then you have all kinds of opportunities for slips betwixt the cup and the lip. So that's something I'm thinking about. It's something we should be aware of. You know, there are texts and subtexts to these conversations, and there are many ways in which they can step right out and tell you what they're actually doing, and you'll miss it because where you see two fingers, they see one.